The worst jobs in human history. We will start from the easier ones to the most horrible jobs in human history. I promise you that you will never complain about your job again. The knocker-upper. Before alarm clocks existed, someone had to be the alarm clock, and that someone was called a knocker-upper. Here's how the job worked. You woke up, voluntarily, at around 4 or 5 in the morning. You grabbed a long stick, or a pipe, or a soft hammer, or sometimes even a pea shooter, and you walked through the dark streets of industrial England, tapping on people's bedroom windows until they woke up. That was the job. That was the whole job. Now, I know what you're thinking. That actually doesn't sound that bad. And to that I say, let me finish. First of all, you're doing this in England, in November, at 4 a.m., in the dark, alone, on cobblestone streets. I'm already out. I'm sorry. I don't care what they're paying me. This job is not for me. But here's the real problem. Your clients, the factory workers, the market traders, the people who hired you, their jobs started at a specific time. If they were late, they could lose their wages for the day, maybe lose their job entirely. And if that happened, they blamed you, the knocker-upper. Because apparently in industrial England, if you missed someone's window at 4 a.m. in the pitch-dark rain, that was a personal failing. And by the way, and I love this detail, nobody ever figured out who woke up the knocker-upper at exactly 4 a.m. every morning. That question apparently just floated around unanswered for the entire era of the profession. Some historians think they just never slept, which honestly tracks. Most speculated they also paid contract knocker-upper who woke them up before 4 a.m. Now that brings more questions, because who wakes the upper knocker that wakes the upper knocker that wakes the citizens up? The pay was also more horrible. Literal pennies a week per client. You needed a lot of clients just to survive, which meant a lot of windows, a lot of knocking, a lot of streets, a lot of 4 a.m.s. The last professional knocker-uppers in England only retired in the 1970s. The alarm clock had been widely available for decades. Some people just preferred the human touch, which is either deeply wholesome or deeply insane depending on your perspective, and I honestly can't decide which. And look, waking people up at 4 a.m. for pennies is bad. It really is. But at least the knocker-upper went home at the end of the day. The next job on our list, the people doing it weren't always sure they'd make it to the end of the meal, let alone the end of the day. Poison tester. Kings and queens throughout history had a problem. They couldn't trust anybody. Being powerful meant a lot of people wanted them dead, and the most elegant way to kill someone powerful, quietly, deniably, at dinner, was poison. So the solution was simple. Horrifying, but simple. You hired someone whose entire job was to eat the food before the king did, every meal, every day, for as long as they lived, which, depending on the king's enemies, could be either a very long time or a very short one. These were called food tasters, or in some courts, praegustators. And before you picture some nervous guy taking a tiny, cautious nibble, no. They ate full portions, proper servings, because a small dose of some poisons takes time to act, and the idea was to catch any symptoms before the king started eating. Now, here's what I want you to actually sit with for a second. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was your career. You went to work every morning knowing that today might be the day someone had gotten to the kitchen. Every plate placed in front of you was potentially your last meal. You ate it anyway, because that was the job. I don't care how good the royal food was. I would not. Some poison testers served their entire lives without incident and retired fine. Others weren't so lucky. There are accounts from various royal courts, including medieval European courts and the court of ancient Rome, of food tasters dying at the table, which, when you think about it, means they did their job perfectly. The king was safe, the taster was dead. Mission accomplished. And the psychological dimension of this job is something I think about a lot, because it's not just the danger, it's the waiting. Every single day sitting down to eat and just not knowing, is today the day? Is it this dish? Is that a funny taste, or am I imagining it? That specific flavor of dread every meal for potentially decades. The Ottoman Empire had poison testers well into the 19th century. Pope John Paul II apparently had one as recently as the 1980s, which means this job existed during my lifetime, and that is genuinely unsettling to me. So, waking up at 4 a.m., bad. Eating potential poison every day, worse. But both of those jobs had something in common. The people doing them were adults who chose the work. The next job on our list, the people doing it had absolutely no choice at all, and they were children, and it gets dark fast, so stay with me. Child chimney sweeps. I need you to actually picture this, not as a historical fact. as a real thing that happened to real children. Victorian England ran on coal fires. Every home, every business, every building had chimneys, and chimneys clogged with soot, and the flues, the narrow tunnels inside the chimney, were sometimes only 9 inches wide. 9 inches! That's about the width of a standard piece of paper. Adult chimney sweeps couldn't fit, so they sent children, some as young as 4 or 5 years old. The children were called climbing boys, and their masters, the adults who owned their labor, often through parish apprenticeships that were basically legal child trafficking, would send them up into dark, hot, suffocating flues with a brush and a bag. Sometimes they lit straw fires underneath them to force them to climb faster. I need you to understand I am not exaggerating that last part. That is documented. That happened. The things that happened to these children are almost too awful to list calmly. They got stuck and suffocated. They developed severe lung disease from breathing soot every day, called chimney sweeps cancer, one of the first occupational cancers ever medically identified. Their knees and elbows were scraped raw. Their eyes were permanently damaged. Some burned alive when they were inside a chimney that was still hot. And they were invisible. They moved through the city in the early mornings before most people were awake, covered head to toe in black soot, and most of London just looked away. Here's the thing that genuinely gets me about this one. A reformer named Jonas Hanway campaigned to end the practice starting in the 1770s. Parliament debated it. They passed a weak law in 1788 that was barely enforced, another in 1834, another in 1840. It wasn't until 1875, after a boy named George Brewster died inside a chimney at Fulbourn Hospital, that enforcement actually became real. Over 100 years of knowing this was happening, over 100 years of children dying in chimneys, and the system kept sending them up. I'm going to be honest with you, this is the one on this list that I can't make funny. Some things just aren't. Okay, I told you that one gets dark, and I meant it, so let's shift gears slightly. The next job is still absolutely disgusting, maybe the most physically disgusting thing we'll cover today. I'm talking about leech collectors. Now, if you're not immediately uncomfortable, give it a second. Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, leeches were not just some weird swamp creature you occasionally heard about. They were medicine. Doctors used them constantly for bloodletting, which at the time was believed to cure everything from headaches to infections to, honestly, anything. If you had too much blood, the solution was obvious: remove some of it. So naturally, demand for leeches skyrocketed, and someone had to collect them. Here's how that job worked. You walked into a marsh, or a stagnant pond, or a muddy, algae-covered stretch of water that already looked like something you should absolutely not be stepping into under any circumstances. And then you waited. That's it. You waited. Because leeches don't exactly jump into buckets. They find you. They sense warmth. They latch on, slowly, quietly. You often don't even feel it at first, just this subtle, almost polite attachment as they begin feeding, and you let them. You stood there, sometimes for hours, as dozens of leeches attached themselves to your legs, your arms, anywhere they could find exposed skin, and when you felt like you had enough, or when you physically couldn't take it anymore, you peeled them off, one by one, dropping them into containers to be sold to doctors, and then you did it again the next day. Now, there are a few problems with this. Several, actually. First, blood loss. These things are literally feeding on you. Not enough to kill you immediately, but enough over time to weaken you, to make you dizzy, to leave you constantly exhausted. Chronic blood loss as a career choice is not ideal. Second, infection. You're standing in stagnant water, covered in open bite wounds, in an era before modern medicine. That is not a great combination. People got sick, a lot. Third, scarcity. And this is where it gets even worse. By the mid-1800s, leeches were being over-harvested across Europe. There were so many doctors using them that collectors had to go deeper into worse environments, stand longer, endure more, just to collect enough to make it worth anything. There are accounts of leech collectors becoming so weak from repeated blood loss that they could barely stand, while doing a job that required them to stand in a swamp for hours. And the pay? Not great. Of course not. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the worse the job is, the more likely it is that you're being underpaid for doing it. So yeah, standing in a swamp, letting parasites feed on your blood for money, that's where we're starting. And somehow it gets worse. Way worse. The gong farmer. Medieval England had toilets. Not great toilets. They were basically holes above pits called gong pits or cesspits, and those pits filled up, and sometimes pretty fast, and someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer. And before you picture someone with a shovel at a safe distance, no. They climbed down into the pit. They were in it, waist deep, sometimes deeper, scooping out human waste by hand into barrels, which were then carted away and dumped outside the city walls at designated spots called lay stalls. They worked exclusively at night, not out of shame, although I imagine there was some of that, but because the smell during the day in a populated medieval city would have caused public chaos. So they worked from dusk to dawn, in the dark, in the sewage, in silence. Now, here's the part where it goes from disgusting to genuinely deadly. The decomposing waste in these pits produced toxic gases, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide at high concentrations is lethal. It acts fast. Workers could climb down into a pit and just not come back up. Their colleagues would pull them out, and sometimes die themselves trying to help. There are documented cases of multiple gong farmers dying in the same pit on the same night because each one went down trying to save the last, which is simultaneously the most noble and the most awful thing I've read while researching this video, and I've been researching it for a while. The pay was actually relatively good by medieval standards because, obviously, supply of people willing to do this was not high. They were also allowed to keep certain materials they found in the pits, which sounds horrifying until you realize that people dropped coins, jewelry, and valuables down these holes constantly. So some gong farmers supplemented their income by essentially mining medieval sewage for lost treasure. I would like to say I would never do that. I genuinely don't know if that's true. The profession existed well into the 1600s, and remnants of it lasted until modern sewage infrastructure replaced it. And when it ended, I'm sure everyone was relieved, especially the gong farmers. If this destroyed your will to complain about your job, good, that was the plan. Drop a comment and tell me which job on this list you think is the absolute worst, because I have a strong opinion and I want to argue about it. And I'll see you in the next one.